Welcome to the Exam Room Live, brought to you by the Physicians Committee. Hello, I am the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll, and this is the healthiest half hour anywhere online today. We appreciate you watching along with us here on Facebook and on YouTube. Coming up today, gastroenterologist extraordinaire, best-selling author, my close personal friend, Dr. Will Bulsiewicz will be here with you as we open up the doctor's mailbag to raise your health IQs. He's going to be answering your questions. And the mailbag already getting full. We've got a great question that we're going to lead off with in just a little bit. A question about eating late at night. What does that do to your body? And can eating the same food at midnight cause you to gain weight, even if it won't when you eat it at noon? I don't know. That's an interesting question, but we're going to ask him about that as well. Plus, a big shift in the medical community recently, where the recommended age for colorectal cancer screenings dropping by 5 years, younger than it has ever been before. So what are the trends that led to this decision? We're going to weigh in on that with Dr. Bulsiewicz as well. So a lot to get to today, but we want to get to as many of your questions as possible. So if there is something that you would like to ask the good doctor, go ahead and post that in the comments or in the chat room. You can also hit me up on Twitter and Instagram at Chuck Carroll WLC or at PCRM. Just make sure that you use that hashtag Exam Room Live. So let's go ahead and open up that doctor's mailbag, get everything rocking and rolling, and welcome Dr. Bulsiewicz to the show. How are you today, my friend?
Hello, Chuck. I'm excited to be here. Hey, did you get a haircut? You look good.
I did. I got tired of the long hair. It got hot and I was like, this is just too much. So I got
summertime in DC.
It all, dude. You know the
very humid
humidity. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. All right. We could talk hair all day, but really, let's answer some health questions. I think that's why people are here. The first question right out of the mailbag is one from Catherine. She wants to know how and why does the body digest food differently when we eat late at night?
Yeah, very interesting. So we are completely programmed with a biorhythm. A biorhythm that is anchored to the rise and fall of the sun. And that's because we evolved with the rise and fall of the sun. And so did the microbes that live inside of our colon. And so it's quite fascinating to consider this, that you could eat literally the exact same food and at different times during the day. And because we have this rhythm, which we call the circadian rhythm, you'll have different metabolic responses. So you could take the exact same food, eat it for breakfast, and you won't spike your blood sugar nearly as much as if you did to eat the exact same food much later in the day. So late night snacking, Chuck, is a bit of a problem because part of the issue is that when we finish eating, we may rest, we may go to bed, but our body doesn't necessarily get to rest. Our gut microbes don't get to rest. In fact, that's when they grab their lunch pail, put on their hard hat, and they go to work. And they help us to process and digest our food. And there's very interesting research, Chuck, that actually I believe was literally published yesterday. This is research that I'm friends with the authors. One of the authors, her name is Sarah Burry. She is at King's College London. And in this research study, what they showed, Chuck, again, literally published yesterday, I believe, or it's going to be published tomorrow, and I probably am not supposed to be talking about it. But either way, in this study, what they showed is they were looking at a concept called dietary inflammation. And effectively, what they were asking was, what happens after a meal? And does food potentially activate our immune system and create inflammation? And when they looked at this, Chuck, it was quite interesting because what they found is that food actually acutely increases our triglyceride level, and our triglyceride level is very closely tied to inflammation. And that's what they showed in this study. And so if you look at what happens after a meal, about 4 hours after your meal, your triglyceride level is substantially elevated, and it remains elevated for at least 8 hours, if not 12 hours. What I'm saying is that if you eat at 10 p.m., then around 2 a.m., you are elevating your triglyceride level, and there is inflammation that is occurring around that, and that inflammation will persist from 2 a.m. until the following morning. And then you wake up and you eat, and your body never gets a break. And so the point from my perspective is that we need to give our body a break. We need to give our gut microbes some rest. And so this is why I advocate for an early dinner, or as early as you can. I mean, to me, that's 7 p.m. or before. And then make a hard rule. Once dinner is over, no food, no late night snacking. If you want to have something, have water or an herbal non-caffeinated tea. That's what I would recommend.
There you go. And look at you breaking news on the show today. That's pretty interesting, man. I like that study. I'm going to try to get my hands on it and dive a little bit deeper on there. That is fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and it was, Chuck, real quick, I'm sorry, but they also looked at, it's a really cool study because it comes from the PREDICT studies, and they had more than 1,000 people. This is a very large study by these standards. Most of these studies have like 20 people. So they had more than 1,000 people, and they also looked at blood sugar. Because many people assume, like you have these people out there right now who are wearing these continuous blood glucose monitors and assuming, oh, if I spike my blood sugar, that must mean that I'm also spiking inflammation. And what was interesting, Chuck, is that the blood sugar is not as relevant. It's the triglycerides. It's the triglycerides, which of course come from animal products, but also can come from ultra processed foods like sugars and sugars and white flours, things like that.
And were the results here consistent no matter what it was the person was eating, whether it be a donut or an apple?
Well, so the choices that you make in terms of your diet are going to have differential effects on your triglyceride levels. And so a donut is going to spike your triglyceride level because it's basically sugar. That's going to spike your triglyceride level far more than the apple is. And so it's not comparing apples to apples to say that eating an apple and a donut is the same thing. And so I think that the point of the study is one, that when we elevate our triglyceride levels after meals, we actually are causing inflammation in the body. And number two, that there is this period of time that is delayed after the meal where the triglyceride level comes up and it increases inflammation with it. And this is why snacking on pretzels at 10 p.m., it may seem like a benign thing, but that's white flour that elevates your triglyceride levels, and you're doing that at 10 p.m., and that inflammation is going to carry into the next morning, and that's problematic.
Well, how about that? To that end, a follow-up from Catherine. She also wanted to know, is it true that you're more likely to gain weight even if you eat the exact same thing at midnight as opposed to noon?
There are some animal model studies that would suggest that this is true. I have not seen a very good calorie-controlled study in humans to make it clear that this is in fact true, that if you sustain or maintain the exact same calories but eat at different times, that you will have weight loss or weight gain as a result of those timings. But I do believe, Chuck, that timing is relevant. That's not to dismiss this concept. I do believe that timing is very relevant, and we do know that people who are shift workers, God bless them, many times those are our public servants. We're talking about nurses, firefighters, police officers. Our shift workers are more at risk for metabolic issues, including weight gain and type 2 diabetes and even coronary artery disease.
And that brings us to a follow-up question from NextGen. Put this in at 12:06 in the chat. Wanted to know what advice you do have for shift workers. Is there anything they can do to kind of mitigate these risks?
It's a little bit tough, but what we would prefer to do if we could is that even though you are working at night, you really you don't want to be eating your food in the middle of the night and then eating a snack and then laying down and going to bed first thing in the morning when you get home from work. So what you prefer to do is have a nice large meal before you start your shift. And the hope is that that meal will mostly sustain you through the night so that you can try to maintain some semblance of a normal biorhythm. The other thing that's very important, Chuck, whether it is being a shift worker or whether it is jet lag and flying across the world, because now we're starting to get on planes again. I just got on my first plane in over a year recently. Whether it's jet lag or it's being a shift worker, an important concept is tying your circadian rhythm to the rise and fall of the sun. And so you want to try to establish yourself. One of the things you can do to anchor this is to, in the morning, is to go and get exposed to bright light. And in the evening, to withdraw yourself from bright light, which when I talk about withdrawing yourself from bright light, I'm not actually referring to my concerns about people being exposed to the sun. The sun's going to go down. I'm worried about the people who are up all night on Twitter and watching television in their bed, because the blue light is actually affecting your melatonin release, which affects your circadian rhythm. And so that's the other thing that we can do, is try to anchor our circadian rhythm to these timings.
Well, man, you hop on Twitter at night, man. There's a good chance you're not going to sleep for a bunch of reasons. You can get on there and just get all fired up, thumbing through. Here's
so true.
I don't know if we have the answer to this one yet. From Jory at 1209. What about teens who seem to be hungry all the time and they want to eat right before bed? So is age a factor here? I'm not sure that the data's in yet or not, but weigh in on that.
Yeah, well, teens are growing, right? I mean, most of the time teens are in the process of growing into a full-sized adults. And so, I think about my son, and my son goes through periods of time where he doesn't eat as much. He's 4 years old, by the way. My daughter is 7, very similar too. They go through periods of time where they don't eat as much, and then they go through periods of time where they're like devouring everything that I can put in front of them. And the next thing you know, it's like, oh my gosh, did you just grow? Like, I think you just grew a little bit. So I do think that there's this element of like, when we're in a growth phase, that naturally you are going to have an increased appetite surge that comes with that. But when it comes to late night snacking with our teens, in a perfect world, I mean, it's hard to control teens. I was impossible to control. But in a perfect world, I mean, these rules still apply. It's still human physiology. They don't get an exception because they're a teenager and they want to have Doritos at 10 o'clock at night. So to the best of our ability, we would prefer to them to not be doing that.
Question from our good friend Allison. She wants to know, do you recommend 3 meals versus grazing throughout the day? What's the take there?
Well, I think that there's a little bit of an intuitive nature to this. So some people are very rigid about these things. They say, oh, absolutely not. You're not allowed to have snacks in between meals. And, the problem is, like, for example, sometimes at 11 o'clock in the morning, I'm really hungry. And if I don't eat, then I'm going to have sort of a toxic level of hunger by the time lunchtime comes, and I'm going to devour everything. And I'm also going to make poor dietary choices when that's the case. And so, like, for me, a piece of fruit at 11 o'clock in the morning takes care of that for me. I feel really well. I'm not as hungry at lunchtime, and I still get to eat. Do I think that we need to like rigidly just do 3 meals exclusively? I don't feel like that's absolutely required. But generally speaking, I don't feel like there are advantages to grazing either. And so based upon what I know, I sort of believe that 3 meals is more the way we should be leaning, but I don't know that there's really strong data to back that one way or the other.
Question from Teresa at 12:15. I'll just go ahead and field this. She wants to know, what days are we live? Well, Teresa, this show is live right now, so thanks for joining us. Every Wednesday, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Join us here for the Exam Room Live. Okay, question from Jana, 1208. Will a fiber supplement make up for a low fiber diet that's high in fat? Interesting one.
A fiber supplement in this setting, a low fiber diet that is high in fat, which I am assuming is something along the spectrum of a ketogenic diet, would it help? Would it be a step in the right direction? Probably. But to call it make up for a low fiber diet that is high in fat, I can't say that it would. In fact, I would argue that when you reduce fiber intake and when you increase dietary fat, that is a combination that we have multiple studies at this point to indicate is not beneficial to our gut microbes. And so, again, can you sort of blunt the negativity a little bit? Can you make it less bad by using a fiber supplement? Sure, I think that may be a thing, but is it going to compensate completely to the point where there's no negative effect from going high fat, low fiber? Absolutely not. You need fiber from dietary sources. That should be the principal source of your dietary fiber. And it's not a matter of counting grams and doing supplements. It's a matter of getting the plants in variety and abundance.
Let's keep chewing the fat here. Take a question from CFY at 1209. Do we need healthy fat in our diet, like nuts and seeds, and maybe some oil to effectively absorb fat soluble vitamins?
Well, there are fat soluble vitamins, vitamins A, D, K, and E, and the absorption of these fat soluble vitamins is improved in the setting of dietary fat. Do we need healthy fat in our diet in order to get these vitamins? I would not sit here and say that there are people who, because, well, globally speaking, when people are on a low fat diet, I don't see that there are these huge vitamin deficiencies in A, D, K, and E as a result of being on a low fat diet. In fact, most of the time, if properly done, a low fat diet is high in fruits, vegetables, whole grain, seeds, nuts, and legumes. And the person is overall nourishing their body and healthier, and as a result, less likely to suffer from vitamin deficiencies. So I don't feel this need where we need to like fear these particular vitamins and be hyperfixated to the point of seeking out additional fat. That being said, do I believe that we can be healthy and consume nuts? Yes, there is no question about that. The data is very clear. Is it possible to consume some oil? Well, it depends on how much oil we're talking about. It depends on what oil we are talking about. Do we need oil in our diet? Should we be seeking oil? I haven't seen any evidence that indicates to me that we should be seeking oil, that we should be increasing oil in our diet. If anything, the evidence to me suggests that we should be reducing the amount of oil in our diet. But that being said, many people do include oil in their diet. And if you do, it should be consumed in moderation with a preference towards extra virgin olive oil.
Here's a question from Catalina at 1218. Wants to know, can you have a healthy microbiome without eating fermented foods regularly?
You definitely can have a healthy microbiome without eating fermented foods regularly. There's no data that says that fermented foods are a requirement for a healthy gut microbiome. In fact, looking at fermented foods and whether or not they are beneficial to our gut microbiome, I welcome additional research. I look forward to additional research. But most experts who study the microbiome are in agreement on this topic, that we believe that fermented foods are beneficial to our microbiome, that they are living foods, that they contain living microbes. And as a result of that, that there is a benefit, there is an interaction that exists between our gut microbes and the microbes in our food. But Chuck, you've probably heard me talk about this before. Fermented foods are not the only living foods. All plants are living foods. If you eat an apple has 100 million microbes that are a part of the microbiome of that apple. And those microbes, just like we have our microbes that help us to grow to be big, strong, thriving humans, that apple has microbes that are there from the time of flower all the way up to fruit. And those microbes are helping that apple to grow and become strong and become the juiciest, most delicious apple you've ever come across. And we do believe that those microbes potentially also are interacting with our personal gut microbiome. So this is one of the arguments that exists in favor of the consumption of not just fruits, vegetables, whole grain, seeds, nuts, and legumes, but in favor of the consumption of some raw foods. I don't think you have to be exclusively raw, but some raw foods, because they have those microbes.
Maybe you have a patient or two that has this problem. Interesting conversation right now in the chat room about somebody who is always hungry. No matter what they eat, it seems like they just are a bottomless pit. Matter of fact, we have somebody in there right now who says that they just ate 3 potatoes and they're still hungry. So what should somebody in that position do? What do you think even could be going on?
Well, I think step number one, anytime we're asking questions of this variety, step number one is, what are we treating here? Right? So we can make assumptions. We can make assumptions and just say, oh, well, it's the food that you're eating. 3 potatoes, how could that fill someone up? There's very little fiber in those potatoes, right? But the issue is that is an assumption, and we need to know exactly what we're treating first before we start doing things like that. When I think about people that have a voracious appetite, I start thinking about, is there an endocrine reason? Meaning, is there a hormonal reason? Could be the thyroid, could be something related to blood sugar control. Those are some of the reasons that I would potentially look at. I think it's a reasonable place to start by discussing it with your primary care doctor, getting some basic blood work that includes your thyroid level and a blood sugar level, and then beyond that, we do know, Chuck, there are at this point multiple studies that are showing us that dietary fiber activates our satiety hormones. In fact, one of the major studies was by Kevin Hall, who is an NIH metabolism researcher, and he compared a whole food plant-based diet to an animal-based ketogenic diet. And what he found during this study, where people were consuming food and they were very closely monitored and they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted to eat, what he found is that people eating the whole food plant-based diet lost more fat than the animal-based ketogenic diet because they were activating their satiety hormones with the amount of fiber in their diet. And as a result of activating those satiety hormones, which by the way is a very important concept because it's your body telling you when you've had enough. By doing that, they were consuming 600 calories less per day and achieving the same level of satisfaction, meaning that they ate until they were full. They didn't want more. They're like, I've had enough. I'm feeling pretty good. And yet 600 calories less per day because of the fiber in their diet.
Whoa, 600 calories. That's what, 4,200 calories a week? That is an insane amount. And then you think about adding that up over the course of the year. Holy moly. Wow, that's a big swing. All right, interesting question here that has to do with keeping things moving. You wrote fiber fueled. Fiber is just, I mean, that is what keeps you moving. But we have a question from Arumi who wants to know whether magnesium can also help to keep things moving. And if so, what time of day should they be looking at taking a magnesium supplement?
So obviously, this is something that you'll want to discuss with your healthcare provider. Not just, hey, I saw Dr. B on the exam room live, and now I'm trying this. But actually, magnesium is fantastic for constipation. In fact, many times I will combine it with dietary fiber and potentially a fiber supplement in order to achieve the optimal effect, which is to keep things moving through. We want our bowel movements to be soft but formed, kind of like a sausage or a snake, if you will. Not to be too graphic, it's hard to describe a healthy bowel movement without being a little bit weird about things. But we want a soft but formed bowel movement, and fiber helps to give the shape. In many cases, fiber will soften it to a certain degree, but in many cases, we need something more to soften it additionally. And what magnesium does, magnesium supplements, is that they pull water into the colon, and that water allows us to keep our stool nice and soft. So, and that can be beneficial to people who are a little bit constipated. Magnesium choices: I would do magnesium oxide, magnesium sulfate, or magnesium citrate. Those are the three main types of magnesium that are good for constipation. And in terms of the timing of it, there's no real hard rule about this. You could do morning if you wanted to, but I typically tell my patients to take it in the evening before bedtime. And part of the reason for that is that magnesium, by the way, is also very good for sleep.
All right, here we go. Doctor's choice here. Do you want the easy question, the intermediate question, or do you want the graduate course level question?
I want the graduate course level question.
All right, then we're going to Vanessa at 1220. Does a high fiber diet help the gut heal after having colitis?
All right, so colitis. First of all, I'm going to assume that what we're referring to is ulcerative colitis from Vanessa, because there are different forms of colitis. Colitis is a very generic word, which means inflammation of the colon. Colitis could be an infection. Colitis could be ischemic colitis, which means that you don't get enough.
She says C. diff colitis.
Oh, okay. C. diff colitis. Very cool. All right. High fiber diet, help the gut to heal after having C. diff colitis. So here's the key point that you need to know, Vanessa, when it comes to C. diff colitis. C. diff is the consequence of an unhealthy gut microbiome that is incapable of suppressing the bacteria C. diff. Many of us, I'm sure myself, many of us have C. diff already living inside of us as a part of our microbiome, and it does nothing to hurt us because our good gut microbes run the show, and our good gut microbes squash the C. diff and keep it under control. All right. So the problem is when we take antibiotics, we are wiping out our microbes, including the good ones. And this is why we are vulnerable in this setting of taking antibiotics to the C. diff rising up, because most of the time, the antibiotics that we take wipe out the good guys, but do not affect the C. diff. So the C. diff starts to multiply and grow, and it rises up, and it becomes a more profound part of our gut microbiome, which can cause colitis. So the key is to support the good guys. How do we support the good guys? Exactly as you're proposing, Vanessa, a high fiber diet. And that high fiber diet doesn't start after the antibiotics. The high fiber diet starts before and during the antibiotics. That is the best way to support your gut microbes while you are taking antibiotics and even afterwards.
Graduate level question asked and answered. I love that, Professor. Anastasia checking in says that she just started reading your book, Fiber Fueled, and she is absolutely loving it. So Anastasia, thank you also for being here today. That's pretty cool. That's got to be really cool, you know, when somebody tells you how much they appreciate something that you put so much time and effort and energy into.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing to, these messages that I get from people. I mean, it just, as a doctor, I feel like it's my place to use my education and my skills to try to help people. And that was really the mission that I had when I wrote the book. And, you never know, Chuck, what's going to happen. I put the book out there. I launched it in the middle of the pandemic. It could have sold no copies. Like, it could have been very weak. And the fact that people are connecting with it and that it's motivating people to eat more plants in diversity, it's amazing to me, and it means so much when people reach out with comments like that.
Let's take a couple of more questions here before we close up the mailbag for this week. Interesting one from an exam room. He wants to know, does the acidity of animal products weaken gut bacteria?
Well, it's not so much the acidity, because what's interesting is that acidity within the colon, believe it or not, is actually a good thing. Acidity comes from short chain fatty acids. So short chain fatty acids, they create acidity within the microbiome, and that acidity, again, short chain fatty acids come from fiber consumption. That acidity actually alters the balance of microbes. There are certain microbes that thrive in that environment with more short chain fatty acids. Those are the good guys. And there are certain microbes that recede and grow weaker and are incapable of surviving in that environment. And those are typically the inflammatory bad guys, like E. coli or Klebsiella, for example. So it's not so much the acidity. The issue is really more so the fat. We have evidence to indicate that saturated fat has harmful consequences within the gut microbiome. We have consistently seen a pattern where the increase of saturated fat is ultimately leading to the growth of unhealthy microbes. I'll give you a few quick examples, Chuck. There was a study that was done in 2014 by Lawrence David, published in Nature, where people ate a completely animal product-based diet for 5 days. They also, by the way, ate 5 days of a completely plant-based diet. So we had both points. And on this animal product-based diet, in just 5 days, they saw the emergence of Bilophila wadsworthia, which is bacteria connected to inflammatory bowel disease, Allostipes putridenus, which is a bacteria that's been connected to colorectal cancer and to abscesses, and Bacteroides species, which are bacteria that are generally considered to be inflammatory. That's on 5 days of an animal product-based diet. On the flip side, on the plant-based diet, what you saw is the emergence of healthy microbes that produce short-chain fatty acids, which we've been talking about, that are so healthy and good for us. So it's not so much the acidity that's the problem. It's more so that the saturated fat is problematic.
All right, here's a really fascinating question from Tim. Wants to know, is getting a wide variety of plants. So if he's going for variety, does having something like 15 bean soup count as 15 different plants or just one because it's in the same meal?
I mean, so I count that as 15 different plants. When you make chili, throw as many beans in there as possible. When you make soup, throw as many varieties of beans in there as possible. When it comes to this concept of diversity of plants, I really sincerely believe that we should make this one of the central philosophies of our diet, so that every single time we're at the supermarket, every single time we're at the salad bar, every single time we're in the kitchen, every single time we're putting food onto our plate, it's on our mind. Diversity of plants. You hear my voice. Dr. B pops on your shoulder. Diversity of plants, diversity of plants. Because when you do this, you are feeding your good gut microbes. Now, do we want to only eat beans and beans exclusively? No, we don't want to only eat beans. We also want to get diversity within whole grains, diversity within vegetables, diversity within fruit, diversity within nuts and seeds. And that's how we create a nice, balanced, biodiverse diet to lead to a biodiverse gut microbiome.
Let's end with this. This is right in your wheelhouse, and I'm sure that when this news broke a couple of weeks ago, you were all over it. Got a question here from Pete. Wants to know, why are we now being told to get colorectal cancer screenings at 45 years old as opposed to 50? What is going on there?
What is going on there has been a series of research studies that have indicated to us that colon cancer is emerging and on the rise in people before age 50. So, and it's been quite disturbing, Chuck. The first studies came out, I believe, in 2017, around this time in 2017, like around June of 2017. And basically what they showed us is that if you were born in 1990, your risk is twice as high for getting colon cancer compared to someone born in 1950. If you were born in 1990, your risk of getting rectal cancer is 4 times as high as someone born in 1950. Since 1995, we have seen colorectal cancer rates in people under age 50 double. They've doubled in literally 25 years in this young population. Now, we can talk about why that would be, but the point from our perspective is to create awareness and consciousness that colon cancer is not just an old person's disease. Yes, the risk does go up with age, but now the risk is shifting towards younger populations. And so it requires vigilance. We are adjusting our screening protocols to 45 instead of 50. But it also requires us that if you are before age 45, if you have a family history of colorectal cancer, you should definitely discuss it with your doctor and see if you're eligible for screening. If you see blood in your stool, you have a change in bowel habits, you're losing weight, you have fatigue, lightheadedness, you get anemic and we're not sure why, you have abdominal pain that you can't explain, these are all reasons to consider getting checked. Because the earlier that we start, the better we will be at keeping you safe. And Chuck, our colon cancer screening program, which has been around since the 1990s, has been extremely effective. All right, so to put this into perspective, we are seeing, they've actually did a recent projection. It was published on April 7th of this year in JAMA. They did a recent projection of what they expect to be the main cancers in terms of risk, in terms of death, all the way out to 2040, so for the next 20 years. And what we're seeing is that colorectal cancer is on the decline, generally speaking, that there are other cancers that are emerging and becoming more problematic. Why? Because we're being attentive to it with our screening program. But at the exact same time, in the exact same research article published in JAMA, they said, so yeah, we are seeing the decline of colorectal cancer, but in people between 20 and age 49, by 2030, 9 years from now, we expect colorectal cancer to be the #1 cause of cancer-related death in people aged 20 to 49. So it is emerging in a younger population. So the point being, we need to be vigilant. We need to get checked as early as possible, as early as they will allow us. And if you have symptoms that prompt you or warrant getting a colonoscopy, I would strongly encourage you to do it. And this is the practice that I live by for my own self and with my own family members.
What's the youngest you've ever heard of somebody having colon cancer?
Outside of having a genetic, so there are genetic conditions that can put people in a position where they could develop colon cancer in their 20s. I had a patient once who was 27 years old, young African-American man, 27 years old, nicest guy. And he was having rectal bleeding and he thought it was just hemorrhoids. And, you know, being a 27-year-old male, he wasn't eager to come to see me to get a colonoscopy. And ultimately we did do a colonoscopy and I diagnosed him with colorectal cancer. And it was heartbreaking.
Mm. Mm. Boy, that's a tough one. Question from Betsy here. This is one that I'm sure that a lot of people who are hearing this right now or watching us live are wondering as well. I want to know, if you have been eating a plant-based diet for years, do you still recommend getting a colonoscopy?
110% without any hesitation or reservation at all. So Betsy, I had a patient once who was a yoga instructor, a vegan for literally decades. And she sat there in my clinic and she said to me, I'm not going to get colon cancer. I don't need a colonoscopy. And I was early in my career and I let this happen. And she died of colon cancer. And it broke my heart. And I will not allow that to happen in my clinic anymore. So this is just an anecdote, but the data are there as well. If we go to the Adventist 2 study and we take a look at the rates of colorectal cancer among vegans and vegetarians in the Adventist population, what we see is there is a decrease in colorectal cancer, but it is not a 100% decrease. It's about a 22% decrease. So what would that mean? If the entire country was vegan right now, instead of 150,000 cases of colorectal cancer, we would have 125,000, 120,000. That's the order that we would be talking about. There would still be a lot of colorectal cancer. And by the way, when I give those numbers are also assuming that people are actually getting screened. So our most powerful tool to prevent colorectal cancer, and what has completely bent the curve to reduce colorectal cancer, like by 2040, right now, colorectal cancer is the #2 cause of cancer death in America. By 2040, it is dropping down that list. And that's because of our colorectal cancer screening program. So to me, it's a no-brainer. And I personally, and in my own family members, I believe in getting it done as early as possible.
I think that the idea of the prep for the colonoscopy is a real deterrent for a lot of people. Eddie asked this question very early on in the show, and I wanted to circle back to it. Asked it at 12:13. Do you have any advice on getting a colonoscopy, even if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet? Is there anything that somebody would be doing differently, or is the procedure exactly the same?
Well, the good news is if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, you are basically on the optimal diet for a healthy gut microbiome going into anything that you have to do with relation to the colonoscopy. The colonoscopy is a very transient event. What I mean by that is that you are going to flush out your colon. And do I want you to flush out your colon on a routine basis? Absolutely not. That's a horrible idea. But is flushing out your colon on one particular occasion and then literally a couple of hours jumping right back onto your healthy whole food plant-based diet, is that problematic? I don't really see that as problematic. If anything, to me, it's very clear the benefits outweigh the risks. So now, the one thing that you have to be conscious of is that if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, the insoluble fiber, the roughage that is in your diet, can get trapped in your colon and affect the quality of the prep. And speaking as a gastroenterologist, the quality of the prep is the most important part for me to be able to do a good exam. If it's a bad prep, I just can't see parts of the colon. So what we need to do is, in the days leading up to this prep, we need to actually go on a low fiber, low residue diet. And that is a temporary thing that you would do for typically about 5 days. Go on a low fiber, low residue diet. And then when you're done, boom, right back on your whole food plant-based diet and get those microbes thriving again.
Let's put a bow on this conversation here. You said that we could talk about why the rates of colorectal cancer were rising among the younger demographic. Would I be correct in assuming that diet is likely the #1 factor there?
Yeah, so there is some speculation as to exactly why this is, Chuck. So let me walk through a couple of the layers of evidence here that we're looking at, as gastroenterologists and as scientists. So first of all, is this genetic? Like, to have colon cancer rates double in a population since 1995, is this genetic? No, clearly not. Because if this were a genetic shift, it takes a lot longer than 25 years for us to see that take effect. So clearly this is environmental. Now, what is it about the environment that is creating this issue where it's like jumped up since 1995? The problem is that there are many different factors. Diet is probably the #1, because when it comes to colorectal cancer, there's the intersection of 3 things that we consider to be critically important to the pathogenesis, the development of colorectal cancer: diet, microbiome, and inflammation. And guess what? Diet relates to microbiome. Diet relates to inflammation. We just talked about it when I broke, this research study that I probably wasn't supposed to talk about today, where I talked about how diet can affect triglyceride levels, which leads to inflammation in the body. All right, so the point being that we do think that dietary changes is a part of the story. It's entirely possible that there are parts. So we know that red meat, we know that processed meats are like the #1 signal from a dietary perspective that pops out. But it may be other parts of our diet. It may be the processed foods that we're consuming. It may be preservatives, additives, things of that variety that are in our food supply in these highly processed, ultra processed foods. But let's also bear in mind, we have an obesity epidemic. We have a diabetes epidemic. Are these things tied to diet? Yes, of course they are, but there's other elements too. There's a study, Chuck, that came out that tied the amount of time that you spend watching television to your risk of developing colorectal cancer before age 50, right? I mean, that's just part of an unhealthy lifestyle. So let's not just isolate it to diet. Let's talk about the importance of sleep, of exercise, of spending time outdoors, of spending time with people that you love, of dealing with your stress. These are all important factors as well.
Man, I feel like we could be talking about this for so much longer, because there are so many layers to this particular story, but we got to leave it right here. But the good news is, Dr. B, you're going to be back here again next month, so we will continue the conversation then. How does that sound, sir?
That sounds like a fantastic plan to me.
I love it. Now, in the meantime, here's what I need for you to do, my exam roomies. I need for you to head over to theplantfedgut.com and check out Dr. B's free plant-fed 7-day challenge. Okay, so what you're going to want to go on there, you're going to want to take that 7-day challenge. What can happen to a person's gut in the span of just 1 week?
Chuck, one of the studies that we talked about, the one where we compared plant-based to animal-based, what they showed is that literally in 5 days, you are remodeling your gut. So in just 7 days, we're even better.
I love that. I love that, how much things can change in just such a short amount of time. And, we live in an era, man, where it's like, we want it and we want it now. So the shorter the time that it takes to get to something good, the better off it's going to be. And everybody can do something for 5 days. You're giving them two bonus with the week-long thing. So I think that that's fantastic. Anybody can give 1 week and see dramatic results. I love that so much. And oh, by the way, you heard Anastasia in the chat room bragging about Fiber Fueled, how much she's enjoying that. So I highly recommend, if you haven't picked up your copy yet, head over to Amazon or your local book retailer, pick up a copy for yourself and get to raising your health IQ, my friend. Dr. Bulsiewicz, you are the man, my friend. You are just a walking, talking encyclopedia of all things gut health. So thank you so very much for being here and helping to raise our health IQ.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you to everyone who came to hang out with us at the lunchtime today, and I appreciate y'all.
You are the man. He will be back again next month. We will be back again next week. But I want to say thank you so very much to the crew behind the scenes that helps to make the magic happen. Thank you guys so very much for all of your hard work. And to you, my exam roomies, thank you so very much for spending some time with us here today. Love you all, as always. And for everyone here at the Physicians Committee, I am the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll. Talk to you again soon. But until then, keep it plant-based.